The throne room of King Malachar was as cold and imposing as the tyrant himself. Its towering columns and gleaming obsidian floors reflected the merciless reign of the ruler. Dr. Elias Vance, a human medic renowned for his intergalactic expertise, stood at the center of the room, beads of sweat gathering on his brow as he completed his work. Lord Varric Arlen, broad-chested and imposing, lay on the examination table, his breathing steady now that the poison threatening his life had been neutralized by Vance's skillful hands. The king's deep voice, laced with mockery, broke the silence. "Well, human, it seems your reputation is not entirely exaggerated. You've saved my life. For that, I owe you a debt." Vance straightened, his features calm, but his stomach churning at the king's tone. "I ask only for safe passage off your planet, Your Majesty," Vance said. Lord Varric Arlen's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Safe passage? How modest. But I am a generous ruler. I shall grant you more, a companion for your journey." At his signal, the heavy doors behind the throne creaked open. The guards wheeled forward a young woman in an ornate yet weathered hoverchair. Her silver hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face of breathtaking beauty. Despite her elegant appearance, her piercing violet eyes were filled with defiance, even as she was presented like an object. "This is my daughter, Princess Celine Arlen," the king said with a mock flourish. "She is broken, as you can see, a useless heir to a throne that requires strength. Consider her my gift to you for saving my life." Vance's jaw tightened, barely suppressing his disgust. He glanced at Celine, noting the faint tremor in her hands and the bruises that marred her otherwise flawless skin. Her eyes met his, a storm of anger and humiliation blazing within them. "Your Majesty," Vance said carefully, "I am a medic, not a trader of lives. I cannot accept—" "Nonsense," Lord Varric Arlen interrupted with a booming laugh. "She's yours now, human. Take her off my hands and do whatever you wish. It matters not to me." Vance clenched his fists but forced himself to remain composed. He knelt beside Celine, speaking softly. "Princess, I won't force you to go anywhere you don't wish to. The choice is yours." For a moment, Celine seemed taken aback by his sincerity. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, she replied, "Anywhere is better than here." Vance nodded and stood, addressing the king with an even tone. "Then we will leave immediately." As they exited the throne room, King Varric's laughter echoed, following them like a shadow. "Take her, human. Let the galaxy witness your folly." The Celestial Voyager, Vance's sleek and utilitarian spacecraft, stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of Varric's palace. Its interior was designed for function rather than luxury, with clean lines and compact spaces. As Vance guided Celine's hoverchair up the ramp, he spoke reassuringly. "This ship isn't much, but it's safe," he said. "You'll have privacy, medical care, and anything else you need." Celine's silence lingered as they entered the medbay. She looked around, taking in the sterile environment and the advanced equipment lining the walls. Finally, she spoke, her tone sharp. "Why did you agree to take me? Was it pity?" Vance paused, meeting her gaze. "No, I didn't agree to take you. I agreed to help you leave. There's a difference." Her eyes narrowed as she studied him. "You don't know me. You don't know me anything." "You're right," Vance admitted, his voice steady. "But no one deserves to be treated like property. Not by your father, not by anyone." Celine's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained firmly in place. "And what do you expect in return for your kindness?" "Nothing," Vance said simply. "Except maybe for you to let me help you. If you'll allow it." Celine exhaled, the weight of her years in her father's court pressing on her. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "Maybe," Vance replied with a small smile, "but that's a risk I'm willing to take." In the days that followed, Celine struggled to adapt to the newfound autonomy aboard the Celestial Voyager. Vance treated her injuries with meticulous care, crafting a custom exoskeletal frame to assist with her mobility. The device, lightweight and seamless, gave her the ability to move with newfound independence. "This feels strange," Celine admitted as she took her first steps with the frame. "It'll take some time," Vance said, walking beside her. But you're stronger than you think. Celine glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You say that like you know me. I'm starting to, Vance replied with a faint smile. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal in the ship's mess hall, Celine finally allowed herself to relax. You're an odd man, Elias Vance, she said. Most would have left me to rot in that palace. Vance leaned back, his blue eyes thoughtful. Maybe, he said, but I've seen enough cruelty to know I couldn't add to it. And you're not someone I'd leave behind. Celine's lips curved into a small, genuine smile, the first he'd seen. You're either incredibly noble or incredibly foolish. Probably both, Vance admitted with a chuckle. For the first time, Celine felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative belief that her life could be more than the chains her father had placed on her. And Vance, he knew that helping her escape was only the beginning. The celestial Voyager drifted through hyperspace, its sleek hull reflecting the vibrant hues of the galaxy's core. Inside, Celine moved gracefully along the ship's corridors, her movements aided by the custom exoskeletal frame designed by Dr. Elias Vance. Each step, though awkward, was a triumph, a testament to her determination and Vance's ingenuity. You're getting the hang of it, Vance said as he walked beside her, ready to assist but keeping a respectful distance. Celine stopped and glanced at him. It feels strange, like I'm a child learning to walk all over again. But it's liberating. That's the idea, Vance replied, offering a small smile. You're not confined to a hover chair anymore. You've got options. Celine's violet eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude breaking through her usual guarded demeanor. Thank you, she said quietly. I'm not used to people caring. Vance shrugged. I'm not used to people calling me foolish for doing it. So we're even. Celine allowed herself a faint smile for the first time. The sterile corridors of the celestial Voyager felt like a place she could belong. Their quiet routine was interrupted by the blaring of an alarm. Vance rushed to the cockpit, Celine following as quickly as her new frame allowed. The ship's sensors displayed a Zorian patrol cruiser closing in on their position. Vance muttered under his breath, his fingers flying across the controls. That's not good. Your father must have realized you're missing. Celine's expression hardened. He won't stop until he drags me back to him. I'm nothing but a loose end. Well, this loose end isn't going quietly, Vance said. Hold on. He engaged the ship's stealth systems, guiding the celestial Voyager into a nearby asteroid field. The maneuver was risky, but it was their best chance to evade the cruiser. Celine gripped the edge of her seat, her voice steady despite the tension. Do you have a plan? Or are you just improvising? A little of both, Vance replied, weaving the ship through the asteroid field with practiced precision. Trust me, I'm starting to, Celine murmured, more to herself than to him. The cruiser pursued them relentlessly, its weapons firing plasma bursts that illuminated the asteroid field. Vance's hands moved instinctively, guiding the ship through the chaos. The celestial Voyager shuddered as it tore through the asteroid field, Vance's hands steady on the controls, guiding the ship with precision. The Zorian patrol cruiser was relentless in its pursuit, plasma bursts lighting up the darkness of space as they narrowly missed the ship. Celine gripped her seat tighter, her eyes fixed on the screen, watching as the cruiser's weapons continued to fire in their direction. Are we going to make it? She asked, her voice calm, but tinged with an edge of uncertainty. We'll make it, Vance said, his voice reassuring but tight with concentration. Just stay with me. As the ship weaved through the dense asteroid belt, Vance's mind raced. He could feel the pressure mounting, the cruiser getting closer, their stealth systems barely enough to keep them hidden. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed the ship further, dodging the asteroids that threatened to obliterate them at every turn. Celine watched him, her sharp violet eyes studying the way he moved, focused, controlled, and calm under pressure. For the first time since she'd left her father's palace, she felt a flicker of something other than fear, an odd sense of safety. How did you get so good at this? She asked, breaking the silence. Vance's lips twitched into a brief, strained smile. A lot of close calls, a lot of practice, he replied, and a fair bit of luck. They rounded a massive asteroid, the cruiser still hot on their tail, but the asteroid belt seemed to stretch on forever. Vance's fingers flew over the controls, sending the celestial Voyager into another sharp turn, the ship's engines whining in protest. Just a little longer, Vance muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. He could feel the strain in his arms as he steered the ship, but there was no room for hesitation. Celine's voice broke through his focus again, steady and clear. "You never answered me. Why are you doing this? Helping me, I mean." Vance hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking toward her. Her eyes were calm, but he could see the underlying layers of anger, frustration, and something else, vulnerability, that she tried so hard to conceal. "I told you," he said, his voice quieter now, his focus shifting slightly as he guided the ship through another tight turn. "No one deserves to be treated the way you were. Not by your father. Not by anyone." Celine looked away, her lips pressed together in a tight line. There was a heaviness in the air now, an unspoken tension between them. Her mind wandered back to the palace, to the years of being nothing more than a tool for her father's political games. The idea of someone seeing her as a person, someone who cared, was so foreign it almost made her heart ache. But there was still skepticism, still doubt. She had been betrayed so many times before. Vance's hands tightened on the controls, bringing her back to the present. "We're almost through," he said. "Stay alert." The ship tore through another narrow passage between asteroids, and for a moment, it seemed like they might just escape the cruiser. But the Zorian ship was closing in, its weapons charging for another volley. Then, suddenly, the ship jolted as a blast hit the side, sending a wave of tremors through the celestial Voyager. Alarm screamed, and Vance's teeth clenched as he fought to keep the ship stable. "Damn it," he muttered, his fingers racing over the controls, trying to adjust course. "We got to get out of this field. It's too dangerous to keep dodging these rocks." Another blast rang out, this time hitting the shields and causing a cascade of sparks from the ship's control panel. The ship veered slightly to the left, the asteroid field becoming even more chaotic. Vance's face was tense, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Hold on," he barked as he slammed the throttle forward. Celine's heart raced, and despite her calm demeanor, she could feel the panic rising in her chest. "We're going to crash," she yelled, bracing herself against her seat. "Not if I can help it," Vance replied sharply, his hands working with near-perfect precision as the ship accelerated toward the edge of the asteroid field. With one final twist of the control, the celestial Voyager broke free of the asteroid belt, emerging into the relative safety of open space. The Zorian cruiser, still hot on their trail, was forced to slow down, no longer able to navigate the asteroids with the same ease. Vance let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his grip relaxing on the controls. "We're clear. For now." Celine's eyes were wide, her breathing shallow as she processed what had just happened. Her heart still pounded in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She glanced at Vance, who was now letting out his own deep breath. You're amazing," she said, her voice unsteady. Vance glanced at her, offering a half-smile, though there was a certain weariness in his eyes. "Just doing my job?" Celine turned away, her mind swirling with everything that had just happened. She could still feel the presence of her father, looming in the distance. King Varric Arlen would not give up easily, and this was only the beginning of what would surely be a long, dangerous chase. "I need to make sure the ship's intact," Vance said, his voice pulling her back to the present. "Stay here. I'll be back in a moment." Celine nodded, watching him as he left the cockpit. Her thoughts drifted again, this time to her future. What did it hold for her now? The palace was behind her. The father who had never cared, never seen her as more than a pawn. He was in the past. But the road ahead was unknown, and she didn't know what she was walking into. What if this man, this human who had so readily helped her, had his own agenda? What if his kindness was only a means to an end? But something in her gut told her that Vance wasn't like the others. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first real chance she had at freedom. She only hoped that whatever awaited them out there, she could handle it. They could handle it. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Celine didn't feel like a prisoner. And that in itself was something worth holding on to. Vance returned to the cockpit moments later, his face now a mask of focus once more. He sat down and glanced at her. "We'll need to keep moving," he said. "We got a little time, but the cruiser will be back soon enough. We can't risk staying in one place for too long." Celine nodded, her resolve hardening. "Where are we going?" Vance smiled faintly, setting a course for the stars. "Wherever it takes us." And for the first time in a long while, Celine felt the weight of the past lift slightly. The unknown stretched out before them, vast and full of potential. For the first time, it wasn't the galaxy she feared. It was her own future, and that was something worth fighting for. The celestial Voyager glided through the blackness of space, its hull sleek and unmarked, a silent testament to the skill of its pilot, Vance. The hum of the engines was the only sound in the cockpit, broken only by the occasional beep of the ship's scanners. Celine sat beside him, staring out into the endless void. Her thoughts were a swirl of confusion and disbelief, the events of the last few days still too surreal to process fully. They had escaped her father's grasp so far, but the feeling of freedom was still alien to her, like a new skin that she hadn't quite grown into. Vance's voice interrupted her thoughts. "We'll be making a stop soon. We need to refuel and lay low for a while." Celine nodded, her eyes never leaving the window. "Where are we going?" Vance set the ship's course, the navigation screen flashing a distant set of coordinates. "A place on the edge of the Valera system. It's off the radar for most, a good place to rest up." She glanced at him, her violet eyes sharp. "And after that?" Vance gave her a sidelong glance, his expression unreadable. "After that, we take things one step at a time. I'm not here to make promises, just to keep you safe." Celine's fingers clenched at the armrests of her seat, her mind racing. What did safety mean to someone like her? Safety was a cage, a gilded one perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. She had been kept locked in that palace for so long, her every move watched, her every word scrutinized. And now, she was out here, free, but with no clear path forward. Her father's influence still loomed over her, a shadow she couldn't escape, no matter how far she went. Her thoughts were interrupted by the hum of the ship as Vance engaged the warp drive. Stars stretched into brilliant lines as the ship accelerated, plunging them into the quiet of deep space. Celine glanced at the navigation console, noting the shifting readings. "How long until we reach the Valera system?" she asked, her tone neutral. "About 12 hours at the current pace," Vance replied. "I'll be in the engine room, making sure everything's in order. You can rest if you want, but I'd recommend taking some time to get used to your new mobility frame. You're going to need it." Celine's gaze drifted to the exoskeletal frame that had been custom-built for her, now securely fastened to her chair. The lightweight alloy shimmered faintly under the ship's artificial lights, its design sleek and seamless. At first, it had been an odd sensation, unnatural, like being trapped inside someone else's body, but it had grown more comfortable with each passing hour. Her hands brushed the frame now, feeling the smooth metal under her fingers. "I've been using it. It's not as bad as I thought." "That's good," Vance said, his voice warm but clipped. "It'll take time to get fully accustomed, but we'll work through it." He turned back to the control panel, the soft click of his boots the only sound as he moved. Celine didn't respond, her thoughts drifting once again to her father. King Varric Arlen. The name felt like poison on her tongue. She had never been anything to him but a tool, a means to an end. Her father's cruelty was vast, and her own existence had been shaped by his cold ambition. Her only value had been as a political pawn, someone to trade, to marry off, to use to secure alliances. The idea that she could escape that life seemed impossible. And yet, here she was, aboard a ship with a human who had no reason to help her except for his sense of justice. Or so he claimed. A voice broke through her thoughts. "You should rest," Vance said, glancing back at her. "I'll wake you when we reach the system." Celine didn't reply at first, her gaze still locked on the vast stretch of space outside. The stars seemed so distant, and the idea of a new life seemed almost laughable. She wasn't free. Not really. Not until her father was far behind. Not until she had severed every chain that bound her. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decisions settle on her shoulders. "Rest sounds like a good idea," she murmured, the words coming out quieter than she intended. Slowly, she began to recline in her chair, her body still stiff from the tension of the past days. Her eyes fluttered shut, but the thought of her father lingered, gnawing at the back of her mind. Hours later, Celine awoke with a start, the jarring sound of an alarm pulling her from her sleep. Her heart raced, her body tensing instinctively as she pushed herself upright. Her mind was foggy, but the urgency in the ship's systems was unmistakable. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice rough from sleep. Vance's face appeared in the doorway to the cockpit, his expression grave. "We're being followed. I've been tracking them since we hit warp." Celine's eyes sharpened instantly, the remnants of sleep gone in an instant. "Oh, Zorian Patrol. They've picked up our trail." Vance's voice was clipped, controlled. "They've been trailing us ever since we left the asteroid field. They must have backtracked to where we jumped from. They're close." Celine's stomach dropped. Her father's influence was already closing in. She had hoped for more time, but it seemed her past wasn't done with her yet. "How long do we have?" she asked, her breath steady but her pulse quickening. "A few minutes," Vance said. "I've got a plan, but I'll need you to stay calm." "I'm not the one piloting the ship," Celine said with a tight smile, trying to ease the tension in her own chest. "What's the plan?" Vance's eyes flicked to the control panel, his mind already calculating the options. "We can't outrun them, but we can hide." Celine frowned. "Hide? How?" "There's an uncharted nebula about 3 light-years away. It's dense, and if we can get inside it, we can use the nebula's interference to mask our signature. They won't be able to track us." The plan seemed simple enough, but the urgency in Vance's tone told her it wasn't going to be without risk. "Do it," Celine said firmly, her voice leaving no room for hesitation. "I'm not going back." Vance's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze steady. "Hold on," he said, before returning to the controls. The celestial Voyager lurched into action, its engines roaring as Vance pushed the ship into full throttle, heading straight for the nebula. The Zorian patrol ship was still behind them, but now it was a matter of whether they could reach the nebula before they were caught. The ship's sensors flared as they neared the nebula, the swirling gas and dust distorting the stars around them. Vance gritted his teeth, his fingers flying over the controls as he maneuvered the ship toward the cloud of particles. They were almost there, almost safe, but Celine knew better than to think that safety was guaranteed. Not with her father so close behind, not until she was truly free. And she wasn't there yet, but she would be. She wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. The ship plunged into the nebula, the stars outside vanishing into a haze of gas and dust. The silence in the cockpit was deafening as Vance held the ship steady. They had entered the heart of the storm. Now, it was just a waiting game, and Celine wasn't sure how long she could keep waiting before she had to face the truth. The silence within the celestial Voyager was palpable as the ship drifted deeper into the dense nebula. The light of distant stars was swallowed by the cloud of dust and gas, leaving them in a murky darkness, punctuated only by the faint hum of the engines and the occasional beep from the navigation system. Celine sat in her seat, her fingers tightly gripping the armrests of the exoskeletal frame, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of their narrow escape. The nebula offered temporary refuge, but she knew it wouldn't be enough for long. The Zorian patrol was still out there, waiting, perhaps already trying to analyze their trajectory. Vance, standing at the ship's control panel, was focused, his eyes scanning the readouts with intensity. He looked more like a man trying to solve a puzzle than a fugitive. Celine couldn't help but admire the cool, collected way he handled danger, even as the tension in her own body grew with each passing minute. "How long do you think we can stay here?" she asked, breaking the silence. Vance didn't look up immediately. His fingers moved over the controls, recalibrating the ship's systems, ensuring their stealth mode was active. "Not long. The nebula's interference is enough to mask our signature for now, but it's not permanent. Once they figure out we're inside, they'll start using more advanced sensors. Celine felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd known the danger wouldn't disappear just because they had found temporary cover. How long until they do that? Hard to say. They're not exactly in a hurry to close the distance. But once we're out of the nebula, they'll catch up quick. We need to come up with a backup plan. Vance's voice remained steady, though there was an undercurrent of urgency she could hear. Celine let out a breath, her mind churning with possibilities. She could feel the weight of her father's empire pressing on her, even from thousands of light years away. The man had never been afraid to make examples out of his children, and now she was no different. If he wanted her back, he would stop at nothing. For a moment, Celine glanced at the small viewport in front of her. The nebula stretched out in every direction, an impenetrable sea of gas and dust. But it wasn't enough to give her peace of mind. Her life had never been in her own hands, always directed by the whims of her father. Now, even though she was free, the shadow of his control still loomed large in her thoughts. She turned her gaze to Vance. He was still absorbed in the controls, but there was something about the way he moved, the way he seemed to carry himself, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than running. "I won't go back," Celine said suddenly, her voice firm. The words felt almost like a vow, something she needed to remind herself of. "I don't care what it takes. I won't go back to that palace." Vance looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment before his eyes softened. "I didn't think you would. But we need to think about what comes next. We can't keep hiding forever." Celine didn't respond immediately. Her hands rested on the chair's armrests, the exoskeletal frame still foreign, but gradually becoming a part of her, like a new appendage she was learning to control. The technology Vance had used to create it was impressive, sleek, lightweight, and unobtrusive, but it still felt like a reminder of what she had lost. She exhaled slowly, leaning back in the chair. "What happens when they catch us?" "We won't let them catch us," Vance said, his tone resolute. He glanced at her for a brief moment, his gaze serious. "You have my word, Celine." The sincerity in his voice sent a ripple through her. She wasn't used to anyone making such promises to her, least of all a human she barely knew. It was a strange feeling, that sense of trust. She didn't know if she could fully trust him yet, but something in her, something long dormant, wanted to. They fell into silence again as the celestial voyager continued to drift through the nebula. Outside, the stars blinked dimly, their light all but drowned out by the swirling gases. Hours passed, each one like a countdown to something unknown. Eventually, Vance spoke again, pulling her from her thoughts. "I've been thinking about your father," he said carefully. "The way he treated you, it's not right." Celine stiffened, her eyes narrowing. She knew what he meant, but hearing him say it out loud made something bitter twist in her chest. "Don't pretend to understand him. You don't know what he's capable of." "I don't need to know all the details to understand that he's a tyrant," Vance replied. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it. "I've seen what men like him can do." Celine met his gaze, her expression hard. "And what do you think will happen when he catches us? When he makes sure I can't escape again?" Vance's jaw tightened. "We fight." The simplicity of the answer startled her, but she couldn't argue with it. She'd spent so much of her life running from her father, trying to hide from him and the endless expectations that he placed upon her. She wasn't sure what fighting would look like, but it was starting to feel like it was the only choice she had left. As if on cue, the ship's sensors beeped, interrupting their conversation. Vance's hands flew over the controls, his eyes scanning the alert. "They've found us," he muttered, his tone grim. The deep rumble of the Zorian patrol cruiser's engines could be felt as they closed in. Celine's heart skipped a beat. "How far?" "Too close," Vance said, his voice hardening. "We don't have much time." Celine's breath quickened as a plan began to form in her mind. Her body might have been broken once, but her resolve had never been. "We need to give them a decoy," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Vance glanced at her in surprise, clearly impressed by her sudden clarity. "A decoy? What are you thinking?" "There's a small asteroid field a few clicks away from here," she said, leaning toward the control panel. "If we can set a false trail, they'll follow that while we slip away. Vance's brow furrowed, but he didn't hesitate. I like the sound of that. I'll prep the ship for evasive maneuvers. Celine nodded, a determined glint in her eyes. Good. Let's make sure they regret ever chasing us. The ship veered sharply as Vance activated the decoy system. Bright, false signals were released into space, a trail of electromagnetic pulses that would confuse the Zorian patrol long enough for them to slip through the asteroid field unnoticed. The Celestial Voyager darted through the small field of rocks and debris, the ship's systems working in harmony as Vance expertly guided them. Celine gripped the armrests, her heart pounding in her chest as the asteroid field grew more intense. This was their chance to escape, perhaps their only chance. They had no time to waste. Vance's voice was calm, but there was an urgency there now. Hold on, Celine. With a quick practice turn, the ship shot through a narrow gap between two asteroids, and for a moment, it seemed like they were free. The patrol cruiser was still behind them, but the false trail had given them the few precious seconds they needed. Celine could only hope it would be enough. As they moved deeper into the field, the asteroid rocks flashing by like meteors in the distance, she realized she wasn't just escaping her father's reach. She was finally beginning to fight back. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she might just win. The asteroid field around them thrashed with dangerous beauty, massive rocks tumbling in slow motion against the black void. Inside the Celestial Voyager, Vance's fingers danced across the control panel, weaving the ship in and out of the debris with a precision that sent a chill down Celine's spine. She was no longer the princess of Zorith, no longer trapped in the palace of lies and cruelty. The cold fear she had carried with her for so long was beginning to crack, replaced by a growing determination to survive, to be free. But the danger wasn't over, and Celine knew that the Zorian patrol was still chasing them. "You sure they're buying the decoy?" she asked, her voice tight with tension as she gripped the arms of her exoskeletal frame. "For now," Vance replied, his eyes flicking between the controls and the sensors. "They're still tailing us, but they'll be distracted for a while. We got a few minutes at best." Celine's gaze flickered to the window. Stars twinkled softly in the distance, a promise of freedom. But she couldn't ignore the weight of what was coming. Her father would not let her go easily, and neither would he let Vance off the hook. "Do you think they'll send more ships after us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, almost as though the words could summon her father's wrath. Vance's eyes hardened. "They'll try, but I'm not going to make it easy for them." She studied him, taking in the calm determination etched in his features. Vance wasn't like anyone she had known before. He was different, kind, but fierce when it mattered. He had given her more than just freedom. He had given her something she hadn't realized she needed: hope. For a moment, her mind wandered back to the palace, to the cold halls, to her father's cruel laughter, to the idea that her life was nothing more than a game, a pawn in his cruel machinations. "No more. We need to find somewhere safe," she said finally, setting her jaw. "Somewhere they won't find us." Vance nodded. "There's a planet not far from here. It's off the Zorian's grid. They won't look there." "Good." Celine looked out at the dark expanse again, as if willing the answer to appear. "We can make it there, but we need to be sure we're not followed." Vance set his hands firmly on the control panel, his voice quiet but determined. "We'll lose them for good." Hours later, the Celestial Voyager coasted silently above the surface of an uncharted planet. The landscape below was jagged, a mix of volcanic mountains and sweeping deserts, almost as if the planet had never been fully shaped by time. The perfect place for a fresh start. As the ship descended into the thick atmosphere, Vance spoke again, this time with a note of calm reassurance. "We got at least a few days before they can track us down here. This planet's too remote for them to notice." Celine's eyes scanned the exterior of the ship. The familiar feeling of uncertainty tightened her chest. Could they really make this work? Could she leave everything behind and start anew? The question echoed in her mind, but she wasn't sure there was any going back, even if she wanted to. "We can't stay in the ship for long," Celine said, her eyes focused on the barren landscape. "We'll have to move quickly, find shelter." Vance nodded and turned away from the controls. He began preparing the necessary equipment, a few weapons, provisions, and tools to help them survive. His movements were quick but deliberate, as if everything had already been planned. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," he said with a smirk, throwing a bag over his shoulder. "Let's go." Celine allowed herself a small smile, grateful for the calm presence he provided. They moved quickly, leaving the celestial voyager and stepping onto the dusty, rocky surface. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. For now, it was safe. As they trekked across the alien desert, a strange sensation washed over Celine, a feeling of freedom, of possibility. She wasn't sure how long it would last, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her past starting to slip away. Hours passed as they hiked through the desolate landscape, and just when the sun began to dip below the horizon, Vance spotted a cave in the distance. "That'll work," he said, pointing to it. "It's sheltered, and we can use it to hide until we figure out our next move." They approached the cave cautiously, stepping into the shadowy darkness. Celine adjusted the exoskeletal frame as they entered, her heart still racing with the uncertainty of it all. When they reached the center of the cave, Vance began setting up a small camp, lighting a fire with equipment they'd salvaged from the ship. As the flames flickered to life, Celine sat down, her body aching with the day's exertion. "Do you think he'll ever stop hunting me?" Celine asked, her voice barely a whisper, though the fear still clung to her like a second skin. Vance looked at her, his face softer than usual. "No, but I don't think you'll ever have to face him again. Not the way you did." The flickering firelight caught his eyes, and for a brief moment, Celine saw something there. Something more than just the medic who had helped her escape. There was understanding, a shared sense of pain. "Thanks," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. Vance chuckled softly, looking away for a moment. "Don't thank me yet. We still have a long way to go." But even as he said the words, Celine knew it was true. This was the beginning. No matter what came next, they were in it together. Her father had mocked her, cast her aside as a piece of his kingdom's broken pieces. But Celine had never been just an object, never just a pawn in someone else's game. And now, with Vance by her side, she was ready to fight for her freedom. For the first time, she had a chance to choose her own future. And that was a future worth fighting for.